Voice over IP has enjoyed a tremendous growth in popularity over the last few years, and there's no sign of it slowing down. Even if your Asterisk system doesn't use VoIP today, there's a good chance it will at some point in the future. To help you better administer an Asterisk system using VoIP, we'll discuss two common network characteristics that can impact call quality. Neither of these directly relate to Asterisk or VoIP, but because VoIP is a network application, the state of the underlying network can greatly affect the performance of the application. The first network characteristic we'll discuss is network latency, or transmission delay. It comes in two main forms. One-way latency is the difference in time between when the source sends a packet and the destination receives it. Round-trip latency is the difference in time between when the source sends a packet and receives a response to that packet sent by the destination. Latency in a VoIP context is usually measured in milliseconds and may be measured with the ping utility. Ping gives the round-trip latency, even though for VoIP we're most interested in the one-way latency. However, ping is handy because it can be measured from a single point. There's not a strict rule of thumb that dictates how much latency is acceptable for a VoIP link, though network latency under 100 milliseconds end-to-end is likely to sound fine. In general, you want the lowest latency you can get. Users perceive high network latency as delay in the audio. This is problematic because the real-time nature of the telephone call is lost if the latency is too high. Network latency isn't the only source of delay in a VoIP call. Converting audio between analog and digital formats at each end of the call takes time, as does the framing and interpreting of the audio data. If there's transcoding between digital formats, there's even more delay. This isn't meant to discourage you. VoIP is well established and can carry real-time telephone conversations among parties across the globe from each other. We mention this to make it clear that an Asterisk administrator has to know about the underlying IP network to be successful. If high latency is affecting your Asterisk calls, there are a few things you can try to do in Asterisk. Eliminate any transcoding if you can, and configure the devices to send media directly to each other instead of through Asterisk if possible. SIP and EECS both have mechanisms for this that are discussed in their respective chapters. Solving latency problems often requires changes outside of Asterisk. Though this isn't the place to get in-depth networking advice, we can offer a few quick tips. Configure the routes between the VoIP devices to be as direct as possible. Make sure that none of the switching equipment within your control is overloaded or congested, and contacting your bandwidth provider is often a good idea. Sometimes, just asking for higher quality or lower latency routes will work, but you may have to shop around to see which provider can give you the lowest latency to the destinations you use the most. The other network characteristic we'll discuss is jitter, which is related to latency. While latency is the transmission delay for each packet, jitter is the variation in latency from packet to packet. If 3 packets all have a latency of about 100 milliseconds, the jitter among these packets is low. However, if 3 packets have differing latencies of 50 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, and 100 milliseconds, the jitter is high because the latency for each packet varies significantly. Jitter is usually measured qualitatively rather than quantitatively. Jitter causes problems because it makes it harder for Asterisk to continually play back received audio at the same rate without delays. If jitter is low, meaning that the latency is relatively constant, then Asterisk knows when to expect incoming media frames and how long it should queue them. If jitter is high, Asterisk must either discard some media frames because they're too late, or never arrive at all, or have a longer queue of buffered media, which means additional latency. Most VoIP protocol implementations in Asterisk offer a jitter buffer, which can queue several hundred milliseconds of audio and reduce the impact of jitter. These buffers work by queuing received frames for a brief time before playing them back to the listener. Queuing gives late arriving packets an opportunity to show up before they're silently skipped. Because a typical frame holds only 1/50th of a second of audio, it's safe to drop a few frames now and then. But if too many frames are dropped, users will experience jitter as gaps or artifacts in the audio stream. Like with problems caused with latency, improving the underlying network is the most effective approach to solving jitter problems. However, Asterisk lets you configure some parameters of its jitter buffers that may help mitigate audio problems. See the sample configuration for sip.conf and eeks.conf to learn more about the configurable parameters. In this module, we talked about latency and jitter. We've shown how each one can affect call quality, and we've given some basic troubleshooting steps to help reduce latency and jitter on your network. An Asterisk system using voice over IP is only as good as its underlying network. Throughout this chapter, we've introduced a few things you'll need to know to administer a VoIP network, as well as several of the fundamentals of voice over IP. Now we're ready to move on to discuss specific VoIP protocols. Coming up, SIP and EEX each get their own chapter. Let's get to it.